Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jefferson Goddard. I'm the curator here at the Salina Art Center, and I'm thrilled to introduce Krista Wortendyke. Krista Wortendyke is a Chicago-based conceptual artist who is part of our current show, Dissonance and Resonance, curated by Chicago and Salina resident Terry Evans. Krista received her MFA in photography from Columbia College in Chicago in 2007. Her ongoing work examines violence through the lens of photography as well as the way news media shows images within the United States. In her words, her work is an invitation to pay attention. Krista found that news media pictures of violence did not communicate the true harsh realities of the situations. The images she creates are a result of a constant grappling with the mediation of war and brutality that occurs both locally and globally. Krista's work has been exhibited nationally at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Schneider Gallery, and Weinberg Gallery in Chicago, as well as the Griffin Museum in Boston, amongst many others. As well, Krista's work is included in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. Krista currently serves as the coordinator for Senn High School's Fine Arts and Performing Arts in Chicago, which is a magnet school. Please help me in please join me in welcoming Krista Wortendyke.
Cool. Hi. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm going to be like in some awkward spot here, right there, because there's a projector that I don't want to stand in front of. But thank you so much. Thank you to the Art Center, and thank you, Jefferson. Thank you, Misty. Thank you to everyone who's been so kind to me. Salina is an awesome place, and the people here have been incredible. So thank you very much for having me. I spent a lot of time today trying to think about where to start with my work and how to start talking about it. Because right before y'all walked in, I was talking to Misty and Jefferson about how much the world has changed since I made some of my work and how it's been recontextualized so much just even in the past year. So kind of like where to start, how do you talk about that when it's changed? So I kind of wanted to start by just saying that, my work has always been, since the very beginning, this inquiry into violence in the media and how the media or how we as people aestheticize violence to make it a little bit more palatable so that we can take it in and process it and then kind of put it back out there, whether that's on social media, in the news. Video games are also something that I'm kind of interested in the aesthetics of. But that really started for me somewhere between, there were two sort of big events in the world, or continuous events. One was the forever wars in the Middle East. They think when I was in middle school, we were at this war, like overseas, that the only thing that I really knew about it was all the photographs that came back, like sort of big explosions and oil fires, like the oil fields on fire and stuff like that. And then and that's it. It was really very beautiful to look at. But then people were coming home and there were all these movies about soldiers with PTSD. And, you sort of saw these things happening and heard them, but it didn't feel very real. Like there was no access to what war was really like besides through all of these different like mediated experiences. So I really took note of that and that really sat with me. And then on September 11th, I was about 80, I think it's 82.6 miles. I looked one time because I was like, wow, where was I? It's 82.6 miles from the World Trade Centers, out on Long Island, and was watching on television while this thing that was happening really not that far from me. These buildings were collapsing, and I found out later that day that a friend of mine was killed in the collapse of the World Trade Center. And it was just this really bizarre experience to have like this triangulation of image and real life. Like I watched this thing that looked like a horror movie on TV, and then it had real repercussions in my life. And so I think from that moment on, it's sort of like got me really interested in like understanding how violence is mediated and how we experience, how we think that we understand the world when we see it through images. And specifically for me, it was violence because I had been looking at those things. So one of my like really big philosophies as an artist is that I think that art is a safe space for us to experience things that are really uncomfortable. And I think it's really important for people to have that experience. I think, you know, out in the world, it's a lot harder to deal with difficult conversations, difficult situations, because they may actually have real repercussions in your life. But when you're in an art gallery, you can like confront these really difficult things and sort of like go head to head with them without them hurting you, you know, or at least they're not real hurt. It's not going to come out and punch you. It might like really impact your soul, but all the work that I make, I sort of hold that philosophy and really try to create things that make people, I don't want to answer any questions for anyone. I just want to put these questions out into the world and say like, hey, have you thought about this? Or what if you look at it this way? Or just, hey, look at this. Have you ever actually looked at this? And so I kind of started, well, I started making things out of all of these movies, video games, and social media pictures from the Iraq War. And that sort of got me, it launched me into looking, I started photographing, after that, I started photographing every homicide in the city of Chicago. So I visited 172 sites in Chicago where people were killed and photographed every single one of those sites. And that was, again, like thinking about how the media talks about homicides in Chicago and what that sort of feels like to actually go to those places and show those places back to people. And from there, I started to, I mean, I've always been obsessed with just media and social media. And so there was a night, it was right after Michael Brown was killed, and there was sort of looting and protesting and stuff. And I sat up all night watching live streams on my phone. And I got really, really interested in this idea, and I could probably turn this on maybe. I got really interested in this idea that I was watching this thing that seemed to me like I was there. Because I don't know if anyone's watched live streams on before. It's sort of like a weird thing that I got into because I just thought it was interesting. But people will actually like record from their phones live and then stream it onto these apps where you can kind of just watch them walk down the street and see what they see. And it feels really, really real. I mean, you almost feel like you're in that spot. And so I'm watching it and I'm like, wow, I'm getting really into it. I feel like I'm there. And then all of a sudden, you know, the internet sort of like faltered a little bit and you start seeing like digitization of the image, or like things skip or there's lines in it. And all of a sudden it was like you were slung back into the fact that you were watching something that wasn't right in front of you. And then realizing that it's this mediated experience, even though it feels like it's right there in front of you. So I started to take screenshots on my phone of all of those like moments. Every time the image would sort of like show some sort of form of mediation, I'd just like screenshot it and hold on to it. I held on to it probably for like 3 years before I did anything with it. I'm that kind of artist that definitely has a lot of folders on my computer that just hold things forever until I figure out what to do with them. So that became like a folder that I had for a really long time. And then we saw this again with Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and I sort of started to do the same thing and sort of watch these live streams and start screenshotting. And eventually I got really interested in just seeing like, what are the other sources that I could kind of take from and look at these different situations. Because another thing that I'm really interested in is like multiple perspectives, and particularly as a photographer, like understanding the idea. And I called myself a photographer, which I actually really reject. So that's weird that I did that. But knowing that you're framing a certain part of the world and leaving another part out, you're really looking at a very specific perspective. So I'm always interested in like, how many perspectives can you get, and can you rebuild like a situation based on, you know, all of the different things. And to give you an example of something that I thought was really cool that was like that was after the Boston Marathon bombing, they were trying to figure out who had bombed the marathon. And I think the police set up like these stations at the airport, and then they set up stations outside of the marathon, and they actually like collected all of the images from people's cameras and their cell phones at the time. And because of the advancements with digital cameras, they were geolocated and time-stamped. So they were able to take all of the photos that they could collect and then kind of like do this thing where they're like, well, we know what happened at this time, so we can go like that. And then we know what happened in this location. And then they like rebuilt the whole scene with other people's photographs. And it fascinated me because that's like using everyone's perspective to like get to some sort of truth. And so I think that in a lot of ways, like social media kind of does that. We have this thing where we get all of these people that contribute to this one place, and you can sort of narrow it down to like, if you have a hashtag, right? If I say like hashtag Salina, all of a sudden I get like 30 or 40 people's different viewpoints of Salina, and I can get like this wider view of what this place is than maybe what I've experienced of it. And so thinking about it that way, when I started looking at all of these other sources where I could find information about, well, mostly video, but video of these protests and uprisings and rioting and all of this stuff that was going on, I just started to be really fascinated with the different ways in which it was imaged. And so I started to just collect things and write and record them and write down all of the things that people were saying. So I went to live streams, I went to the news, I went to Twitter and found people's, you know, like cell phone images and stuff like that, and just collected. And I started to build what has become this project called Mass Observation. And it's called Mass Observation because there was a 1930s sort of like experiment, I would say, in England, where they hired all of these sort of average people to document everyday life in England and to like contribute to this sort of like archive of what it was like. And so I started to see this sort of social media aspect as being our new version of what this mass observation project was. And so I started to put all the images together, and thinking about social media, I was like, well, I don't know if this happens here. Well, it does happen here. You have that Salina, welcome to Salina sign, which is absolutely 100% made for someone to take a picture and put it on social media and say, I was in Salina, you know? And so in Chicago, we have a lot of restaurants that design their entire restaurant around the idea that people will Instagram something and put it up. So there's this like very specific aesthetic that goes into posting on social media. And so I started to take all the images that I had and to sort of crop them into what I deemed like Instagram worthy photographs, squares, obviously, and create these like this giant feed of them. So it imitated the social media platform and the aesthetics of it, you know, this really beautiful sort of thing. But when you get close up to it, it's really appalling. And so, you know, what you can see in these images, which you can't really see here, but if you take a walk out to the front after and kind of take a look, there's buildings burning. There's just sort of horrific things going on in all of these images. But if you don't get close enough to look, they really do look like this beautiful cloud of colors. You know, it's gorgeous. And for me, that's my experience of what war and violence has always looked like in the media. And so I'm sort of imitating that. The funny thing is that I've shown this photograph here is of this project in a place called Filter Photo in Chicago, but often I put it outside in the public. And the idea with that is that there's a couple things. I really believe that when someone walks into an art space that they're sort of already anticipating what they're going to see and sort of have already bought into the idea that I accept what I'm going to see in this place. It might challenge me, but I sort of accept that. But when you put something out in the street and sort of insert it into the everyday world, you get a whole lot of people that would never walk into a gallery that are going to be challenged by something that they see. And maybe they'll just walk by it and maybe they won't pay attention to it, but maybe they'll stop and maybe they'll wonder what it is and maybe it'll make them think for a little while. So I'm always really interested in trying to interject into the outside. And so here, there was sort of a back and forth here when I was putting this work up, and we wanted to put it on the outside, but it just kind of didn't work out that way. So it's right in the front window, which I really enjoy because I still think people can kind of, that weren't necessarily looking for it, would still see it. And it has the aesthetic of the street. You know, it's plywood. The images are laser jet prints, so they're made with like a wax, so you can get them wet and they don't bleed. And so you put wheat paste right over the top of them, and it looks like when you're walking around New York City and there's advertising all over the place. And so I've really sort of like kind of adopted that. But when I've done it outside in the past, some really interesting things happen. I always attach it to a hashtag, because if you have a hashtag, then you can follow it and see what happens to it. And people comment and post it, and you can sort of see a conversation start to happen around it. And I had it in Chicago at one point, and it was outside of a bar, and almost every night there was a group of like blonde girls in tiny dresses that would like, different ones, not the same one every night, but like different ones that would pose in front of it and like not recognize what it was that they were posing in front of. And I found that to be fascinating. They never they thought it was really beautiful and never took the time to look at it. So I collected all of those too. I have all of those, and that's a folder that I don't know what to do with yet. But this project has really, really, really shifted over the last year, because it was created before George Floyd. It was in a lot of ways created with a lot more distance than what I have felt now. During the protests after George Floyd was killed last year, Chicago was sort of a giant disaster. And my neighborhood in particular, I lived right down the street from a fire department, and they have 3 fire trucks and an ambulance, and they did not park once that night. And they had extra fire trucks that were just like lined up on the streets. And from where I was, I heard just like a lot of sirens and a lot of action. But when I woke up the next morning and went around, basically like 2 blocks around the corner, everything was broken and boarded up, and you know, it was very, very close. And so it was a really different experience to see this stuff like on TV versus actually having that experience. And so that changed it changes the way that I think about the work. And I also think that over time, you know, with all the different things that happen in the world, like there's always going to be new context around the things that we're looking at. And I was saying earlier that I can make something and control what it is when I make it, but once it's out in the world, like I don't have control over it anymore. It means something totally different all of a sudden, you know, and I can't do anything about that. And sometimes I've made things that I'm like, at this point, I'm like, I don't want that to be out there anymore. It means something so different now that like, I don't even want it to be under my name, you know, but that's a whole nother story. So from this project that's out there that I hope y'all can get out there and see, I started to work off of that to do this work here, which is called Transmissions. But before I start talking about that, I'm gonna show you a video of how I sort of like went from that out there to this in here. And it was an in-between spot, and it was right as the George Floyd protests were happening in Chicago. A friend of mine and I created this piece called What Now? Oops. And it was, nope, that's not the right one. It was completely 100% in response to the George Floyd protests. and feeling during COVID very stuck and unable to contribute to the conversation, because it was really scary still at that time to be outside and to like really contribute to going to a protest or really anything. So we tried to find a way to be a part of the conversation. And so I'll show this to you. And I also showed this, just to give you some context, I showed this to the students, or the campers, I call them the campers, at the St. John's Missionary Baptist Church. And we worked on a project with this in mind this week. So hopefully you'll get to see that if you come back, because we're going to bring those here. But I'll play this. It's about 7 minutes long, and then I'll keep going. I can stop that now, because what we ended up, the rest of the video sort of shows that we took that and we recreated it at our school. We both work at a high school, and at the beginning of the school, one thing that we really wanted to be able to do was what we saw happening with all of the board ups in the city were that it was predominantly white artists that were painting Black Lives Matter paintings and murals on all of the board ups, and sort of beautifying their neighborhoods in a way. And it wasn't, it's not a judgment or a mistake or anything, but it was just, it felt like the voices of the people that needed to be heard still weren't really being heard. It was other people that were still speaking for them. And so when we were given the opportunity to do the facade of this place, we really wanted to find a way to open the conversation up and not make it about us and what we thought, but to like allow a conversation, especially at a time where people were really uncomfortable being together. So it was a way for people to respond to each other outside of the context of like an actual conversation, you know? And so we took this and we made it at our school. And what was really, it was a little bit of a different context, you know, like these kids hadn't been to school yet. It was the 9th graders coming to pick up their books and go back home for remote learning. And so they weren't going to meet their classmates, and they just kind of were going to pick up their stuff and go back home. And so we created this as a way for them to respond to each other as well. And they actually responded very similarly to the way that the people in the neighborhood responded. Some of them used it as like what next? Oh, I want to go to D1 and play this sport or whatever, which was great. But there were also kids that were like, I'm still thinking about this, and I want to talk about this. So it kind of like lived on for a really long time. And our advisory team at our school actually picked it up and used it as a project that then had a trajectory through the entire year. So kids were constantly responding to this idea of what now, which was an amazing thing that came out of it. But what I did with the kids down at the camp this week was that we had them generate questions that if they wanted to put a question out into the world, what would that question be? What's something that's important to them that they could put out there? And part of what we talked about was we watched this video, but we also talked about this idea that, you know, we very freely allow advertising to infiltrate our everyday, and we don't question it, and we just let it be, and that just exists. But the voices of other people that are maybe not the corporate beings out there, their voices it's always harder to get their voices out there. And so this was a way to get them thinking about like how to have a voice and how to insert their voice into the outside. And so they came up with some incredible questions and worked together to make these. They're about 4 feet by 4 feet boards. They're pretty sizable, especially for they're small kids. So they have pictures of them standing behind it, and their faces are barely over the top. But they're going to bring those boards to the art center here and show them, and bring the kids down here as well, which I think will be really great, because I didn't talk to a kid who had been here yet. So you'll have some little future art lovers hopefully coming in soon. But I guess to jump off from that project, I started working on this because really Terry Evans, who's the curator of the show, she's in a critique group with me, and she really started to challenge me to make some new work. And she wasn't going to accept me just putting stuff in that I had made before. And so I had like a year, and she was like, let's make stuff. Come on. She's just a perfect teacher, you know? It was like, I didn't know if she did it intentionally or not, but it was very teacherly of her, and it worked. So I started working on thinking about these things that I had been thinking about for a really long time, and sort of melding them together with the aesthetic that I was seeing in Chicago all around me, and how that was sort of affecting me. So in the same way that I explored looking at all these different streams and videos and everything of these protests that are part of mass observation. And by the way, the pictures in mass observation go from about 1960 to today. So I started looking back as far as color television, and looking at what happens when the transmission through color television starts to, you see the lines in the TV and stuff like that, and sort of capturing those moments as well. But these were exclusively images taken from the George Floyd protests. And I started just to collect them and collect them and collect them. And some of the things that I started to notice that really got interesting to me were that there were over and over again images of either police in a formation, like in no matter what city you were, there were just, there was so much control happening with like lines of police officers. And then on the other side, there were all of these protesters that were using their phones as a sort of way of protecting themselves. And the first thing that really struck me, and the image that struck me first, was this one in on the yellow side, on the right side of the yellow, where there's a guy with his phone up like this, and it looked like a power fist. And I was really intrigued by the idea that this phone was a source of power for people, and that it actually like literally looked like a power fist. And so I was thinking a lot about how these two sides were sort of coming together, and they both had it's like organization and chaos, and then you don't know like which one's causing the chaos and which one's causing the organization, because in a lot of ways, like the people that are protesting have their own sort of form of organization. It just doesn't look like the police, like sort of militant organization. And so I just started pulling all of these images apart and kind of looking at them together, and noticing that there was this like constant theme, where there was one side and another side being imaged over and over and over again, and there wasn't really a lot of overlap. And a lot of the video that I watched was from helicopters. And this is true for most of the like sort of like protests and uprisings and rioting and everything that has come from police violence across like the past, at least what I've watched since like probably like 2014, is that most of it is filmed from above, from a helicopter. So you're really watching a lot of things like happening in these formations and stuff. And I listened to the helicopter pilots talking, or I guess it's a news reporter in the helicopter with the pilot. And depending on which incident it was, and which city and which, station was actually like, broadcasting it, the language that was used was so very different. And what I found about the George Floyd protests was that a lot of the language from the helicopter, like reporters, no matter where it was really militant. And so I started to just pull those words out. I was really interested in those really specific words that they were using. And at my house, in my studio, I have an entire wall full of just like words that were used by the helicopter reporters. And so what you're seeing on top of these images is actually, it's almost like a hieroglyphic of those words. So thinking about phones and about how phones are such a immediate way of communicating. It's the way we look at the news. It's the way we transmit information. It's the way that we sort of like exist in this world. There's this function on phones, and a lot, like some people, if you use it, you know about it. If you don't use it, it's cool. But basically what you do is you can swipe from your one letter to the next. Instead of typing things out, you just go like this and it puts together the word for you. It's like a smart text. And so what I did was I got a big, like, type whatever the phone, like font stuff, whatever. I can't think of what it's called. And I just started drawing those words out and the patterns that they would make if I were swipe texting these words. And they came out to be these really interesting patterns that really did look like hieroglyphics. And I was kind of interested in that you couldn't really read them right off the bat. They're not like a recognizable word, but they definitely mean something. And I kind of put those over the top of these with spray paint. And I actually used the same machine with the kids at the church to create their font that I did for these hieroglyphics. And it's just like a laser cutter that cuts out plastic and you can create a stencil with it. And then I spray painted over it. And the choice of spray paint and the choice of all the materials was really because that all of these materials were like hyper present all summer, last summer. It really drew from the aesthetics of the street outside my door. So, industrial screws, plywood over all the windows, like wheat pasted pictures and images, and then spray painted messages. And there's a sort of like desperation to those kinds of materials and messages because they're so they're not precious in any way. They're very like pedestrian sort of like things that anybody can get their hands on and do really fast and try to get a message out there. And so I kind of like appropriated that aesthetic to create these. If you scan that QR code over there, which has become like the language of the pandemic, which the last restaurant I went to before the world shut down, they put down a menu that was just a QR code. And I was like, what is this? And now it's like everyone knows what a QR code is. But this QR code takes you to a YouTube video that kind of goes through the process of how you can swipe to text to get these symbols. And one of them says phalanx and one of them says provoke. And those were, like I said, directly taken from helicopter pilot or helicopter reporters language. And so I feel like I'm talking a lot, which I should be because I'm the one talking, but I also would love to hear if anyone has any questions or anything that they'd like to know or any thoughts.
Question that I had a thought.
Sure.
When you were highlighting the blog names, you mentioned that you would hash them.
Yes.
And so for me, I was wondering if you ever multiple kind of source material, and it seems like you are very comfortable in the way to do this. I'm wondering if you ever thought of the hashtag as a presentation.
Kind of. So that's a great question. The mass observation for that filter show, the one that I have the picture up here, the entire length of that show, I would post on an Instagram feed every day a new one of the squares from that mass observation. And as a part of that post, I took direct language from news reports that had to do with each one and paired them up with text. And that became part of the exhibition itself. And so I really tried to figure out how to use the source of where it's sort of coming from and inspired by it to like turn it back on itself. And there's some stickers out there that have the actual like like Instagram account that you can go to and see them. I haven't been posting them this time, but you can kind of go back through and see all of the different postings and all of the language around it. And I was, one of the things that I haven't figured out how to, I want to say capitalize on because that's not really the point, but like try to figure out what to do with is all of the sort of, I mean, I'll show you, I have some of it with me just because it happens to be in my sketchbook, but like these are all things that are just things that I've written down from news reports and it's just things people have said that I'm fascinated by, like the language that people use and how they talk about things. And it's just sitting here, again, another folder that like things go into, and I'll figure it out later. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So it was meant to mimic an Instagram feed. And so.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because so then for Zoom.
No problem, no problem. So the question was why the square instead of the rectangle for the piece back here? And that choice was made so that it would mimic an Instagram feed. And also it goes this way, which Instagram feeds go this way, but they do have 4 images across. So I tried to mimic it as much as possible. One of the things that I did think about doing initially was creating something that came off the wall and like came across the floor, like a feed itself. But there's something about the wheat pasting and that like street language that I would lose in that piece. And also like the piece, I went back and forth when I was working with the art center, because it's not easy to install. And one of the options was to try to print it on like an adhesive vinyl and put it up directly on the wall that way. And I got really worried about what would happen if we did that, because there's something really raw about wheat pasting it, and it's got like a lot of texture and it looks like the street, but when you do something really clean, it looks like advertising, and then you're sort of like delving into this area that's a little bit uncomfortable with what the images are. It's actually like sort of making them prettier than they already are. And so I was a little bit afraid of that, and that went off on a real tangent from your question, but yeah, it gets destroyed every time, or repurposed and put out on the street. I've done it a couple times where I've taken installations from in a gallery space and then just like taken them down and put them out in the street and kind of left them there.
How does it feel compared to dust? Which I would think they would be that.
Yeah,
And who knows? 10 years with black gloves.
Yeah. So the question was, how does that feel in comparison to these on the wall here, which in some ways are like much more precious objects, which is a weird territory for me to be in, because I like the idea of a gallery space, but I've never fit into like a white cube gallery, because I think that everything I make, I'm ready to throw it away as soon as it's done with. I'm not like, you have to have this very precious thing in your home. I have no problem with that. It's just not the way that I work. And so making these, while I was making them, someone was actually like, man, these are like, people might like want to buy these. And I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that. You know, like I don't really make things for people to buy. Like it's nice if they want to, but a lot of it's really challenging, violent, you know, like stuff that, I don't know. I know people put stuff on their walls that's not like super happy, but I don't know.
Is it the subject matter that you, or is it just, it's not in your vocabulary in terms of festivals?
I think it's,
You're still going.
yeah, I think it's sort of, it's not in my vocabulary entirely. I have made things that are very like, you know, white box, like beautifully framed images. I have a series of work called interventions that are appropriated images from history, where they're basically sanctioned violence across the whole world. So there's lynchings, beheadings, like all of these really horrific sort of situations. And I take those and I block out the really horrific part and sort of draw attention back to all these crowds that are watching these things. And they're small, and they're framed in large white mats, and they're in beautiful white frames. And that in some ways for me, that's where it's subversive, because it's like, oh, it's a beautiful gallery space. Oh, this thing is horrible, you know? So I think I like to play a lot with the line of what's going too far. Like how far can I aestheticize this without tipping over the edge of being like on the wrong? It's always teetering. And the funny part about teetering on that edge is that it shifts all the time based on what's going on in the world. And so you're kind of always like trying to stay on the tightrope. You know? But I do, I am interested in these as art objects too. You know, I think there's something interesting about that, especially coming from the place of them really echoing something that was really difficult and hard to see and hard to kind of like process. So I do think it's interesting to like, and again, like sort of subversive to create something that's more of a precious object out of that.
Having light be into another space, like sound,
Mm-hmm.
how it moved. People responding to it. Just aggressive. So there would be another dialogue, that a thread. The actual phrases or words. Right?
Cool, thank you. Oh yeah,
A couple of questions.
sure.
First one from Zoom. So what will happen to mass observation?
Well, I've got a little tiny truck, so it's not coming with me. But that's a great question. I mean, I think that it would be interesting to see if anyone in Salina would want to. I would be open to anyone that wanted to do something with it, to kind of take it and create something with it. I sort of think that like my ownership over it is done once it comes off that wall. You know, the church, they wanted to do a what now wall, and they were like, but you're only here for a few days. And I was like, look, I'll tell you how to make it. Just make sure you give me pictures. You know, it's not mine.
Question is Krista a trained artist or self-taught?
Oh, very trained. I have a BFA in photography and an MFA in photography, and then taught for 9 years Jefferson. And now I run a fine and performing arts magnet at high school. So I've got a lot of art. Sometimes it's hard to talk to other people. But, cool, thank you.
You talked about the space that you were in the beginning, and you're from this one vantage point at the very beginning. I was curious, are you talking about the way that you actually absorb or understand media, the way that you're collecting it, or the way that we're collecting it as the viewer?
You mean, when I was talking about sort of like trying to get as many vantage points as possible? Yeah, I think that's what sent me down the road of like trying to collect all these images from all of these different sources, kind of like see what was out there and how these multiple images could inform my understanding of, you know, what was happening, because clearly I wasn't there to experience it. And even if I was, I'm still only experiencing like a small portion of it. So like really in the same way that like Boston Marathon information came together, to like really get out there and see how much can I collect from that one place and try to put it all together to like gain an experience. And so, you know, that mass observation in some ways is an attempt to kind of like say, while there are multiple different events, there's like an aesthetic that goes with those events that we see. And they're from all different places and all different people and all different sources, but they sort of come together very fluidly. And that's surprising. you know, that we are sort of almost, it's like we really like things that are aesthetically pleasing. We like things that are designed well, and we'll look at them and we'll sort of gravitate towards them. I mean, I think that's why, you know, I gravitate towards Justin's work, is it's colorful and beautiful, and his work in some ways does some of the same things that mine does. Is then you get close to it and you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's not what I thought I was looking at first, you know? And so I don't know if I'm answering a question. I might not be at all, but, but I guess like I'm just constantly sort of thinking about how many perspectives are out there and how you can try to find your way into those different perspectives to really gain a whole. One of the things I do with students often, actually like about 7th and 8th graders, this works really well with, is I will give them all a camera, or they'll use their phone or an iPad or whatever, and I'll make like 2 people in the middle do something, like they're doing rock, paper, scissors, or something like that. And then I'll set kids up all over the place. They're like up here, down there, photographing from like really far away. And then I'll just count to 3, have them all take a photo at the same time. And then they have to look at all of those different photographs and see how different things look from different places. And not only do you learn that it depends on where you're standing, what you see, but that you can translate that then into, you know, your position in life, you know, how old you are, where you live, what your, you know, income is, what race you are, all of that stuff affects what you see and how you see it. And so I'm really interested in kind of like delving into how media does that for us, if that makes sense.
Question. It seems like this collecting all these different perspectives is a kind of a crowdsourcing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're saying that there's also sort of a crowd ownership when the work is like you're happy to disperse it, and you're talking about that as an aesthetic choice. Is there an ethical position in there too?
Sure.
We live.
Yeah.
It's all right. So you're working with people in the cultures who are the immediate,
Mm-hmm.
probably not this, you know.
Yeah.
And then you have your perspective and all of the things.
That is a fabulous question. I don't know if you heard that at home. Where is truth and where can we find it? If you know, let me know. Yeah, where is truth? That would be wonderful, actually. But I think that's the heart of the question too, is right. Like everyone has a different experience of the world. So like there is no real truth. I mean, there are things that are sort of facts. Like there's a floor here. I know that, I think, right? But like in terms of experiences, like I don't think any of us could ever think that we know someone else's experience, you know, although we pretend that we do all the time. You know, that's like how we can manage to have rules and regulations and, you know, all of these things that create citizens, because we're all supposed to sort of fit into these certain molds to exist together. You know, like there's got to be some rules so we can all exist together harmoniously. But in that, I think a lot of like the personal experiences of people get sort of shut out and say, well, that couldn't be true because this is true, you know, because that's what I saw as true. That's a really, man, I'm going to take that question home with me. That's a great question.
Norway, somebody has to be truthful themselves.
No, wait. So in Norway, they have, can you say that one more time?
Well, as I'm saying it out loud, I just don't know how the details. Like I believe there's a law now in Norway, especially transgenders that post everything online.
Sure.
They have to identify what is true.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of,
So,
like, what did they use in terms of Photoshop, or what did they use?
okay.
Talking about the truth.
Yeah. So in Norway, there's like this rule with social media that you have to, okay, brand new rule, where you have to identify whether they're like, whether things have been photoshopped or not photoshopped in images, which is also kind of an interesting thing because I don't know if you remember this, but there was an LA Times photographer. It has got to be like 10, 15 years ago at this point, but he was photographing in the Middle East and he took a bunch of pictures and he put them together. He photoshopped them together and somebody caught it. It ran on the front page of the LA Times and someone caught it because there were like multiples of a single person. And he ended up getting fired. He had been there for like 15 years and he ended up getting fired. And when they asked him, why would you do that? He said, well, the combination of the images together felt much more real than any of the single images that I had. So like, it felt like it told the story much more truly, which is interesting, you know, because that's another, you know, it's not technically true, but it's true to the way something felt, you know? So we get into some crazy territory when we start talking about that. I love it though, for sure. Sure.
Back to the question of the lady.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, we skipped over that part.
That question.
Yeah, can you tell me that question again?
Well, it's just, is there some kind of ethical position in the way you crowdsource and then crowd disperse your work?
Okay, so is there an ethical position with the way that I crowdsource and then sort of like crowd release my work? I have a really, I think just because of the way that I think about art, and the way that I think about it as something that exists, like just for me, and I know that this is not true of all artists, but just for me, I think of it as like this way of getting people to think, and really kind of like pushing things out there and saying, you need to think about this. Part of what needs to happen in order for that to happen is for it to be publicly accessible to people that don't have access, or don't think they have access, or don't feel like they belong. Say, you know, I'm sure there's plenty of people in Salina that just don't, they probably walk by here and they're like, well, that place isn't for me. I just, you know, for whatever reason. And that, I mean, absolutely, like in, you know, some of these white cube galleries in Chicago, I know lots of people, including myself, that is like, I don't, that's not for me, you know, like, but I think by putting it out, like sourcing it and putting it out into the public and letting the public sort of own it, I get to learn a lot more about what people think and feel. And I mentioned earlier that I kind of put a hashtag on anything that goes out into the world. So, you know, if this were to go out from inside the art center and someone wanted to do something with it out in public, put it out in public, the only thing that I would ask is that I just want to have some sort of hashtag attached to it so that I could watch what the interaction is with it. And I could see how people talk about it and what it does for them. At one point I had a piece that was the Killing Season Project, which was all the homicides in Chicago, which is like it's like a 56-foot long installation piece that was made on drywall. And I literally dropped it out of a van against the side of what used to be the Mega Mall in Logan Square, which you might be familiar with. Now it's gone, but it was closed at the time. And it was, I don't know, 14 maybe drywall panels. So it was big. And I had to leave town and it had a hashtag on it. And I was just watching people take pictures of it, talk about it, have really interesting discussions about it, like just on social media. One of the pieces fell over because it, like, you know, trucks go down the street and I think the wind just like one of them fell over. Saw a picture of it down on the ground, saw a picture of it picked back up, went over to pick it up after we had a big rainstorm and it was piled really nicely next to a garbage, I was going to pick it up because I didn't want to leave the garbage there. And it was, someone had piled it really nice. And it was a really interesting thing to just give that to people and let them kind of interact with it and decide what it was worth, and definitely some people at least found it worthy enough to like take care of it and try to figure out what to do. And so I think that's kind of interesting too, especially in spaces where, when you walk into a gallery, art is precious, but out in public, people will spray paint right over your artwork. They don't care, so it's interesting to see whether they do that or not, or what they take note of. And, yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Asked if I run into any problems putting my artwork in public. No, oddly, not yet. Yeah, a little bit of everything. Sometimes I have the permission, like I've done some murals on buildings that I have the permission to do. But I've also just straight up like put a whole bunch of drywall panels in the back of a van, put on, like a onesie suit, acted like I was supposed to be there with a friend and just Betsy Odom and just like, put them up against the wall and walked away, and then came back later in a different outfit so I could take photos. But when I've done it on walls that were sanctioned walls, yes. But when I just do it and plop it out there, no. I think, in the case of that Killing Season project for at least the first, I made it in 2010. And so for at least the first like 7 years, I wanted to make sure that it got out into the public once this summer in a way that was really not through a gallery. I wanted to put it somewhere. It felt like something that needed to be in a neighborhood that was gentrifying, not in a neighborhood where they're super affected by violence and they already know it. And it's just like, yeah. But to put it somewhere where people who are sort of young and, have this sort of like activist spirit about them, but maybe don't know what to do with it, to give them this information and say like, look, this is this thing that exists in our city. You're responsible for this too, and hopefully get them to sort of pay attention to it. I think something that happens in Chicago a lot is that we very easily can say, that's not my problem, it exists somewhere else. And so I don't have to put any energy into it. It's someone else's problem. But really, in the end, it's all of our problems. And a lot of people just write it off and say, well, it's just the South Side. They can handle it. Really, if we just all work together, probably be helpful. But.
All right, we don't have any more questions.
Okay. Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.